In 1960, not too long after my sister Renee was born, our family of 4, plus Big Steve's bird dogs, all packed up and moved from the small, hard-sided rental house where we were living on Highway Drive in South Jackson, central Mississippi. And we headed right on down to southwest Mississippi to the little town of Summit. Big Steve was working as a lineman for Mississippi Power and Light Company, where he was transferred from the main office in Jackson down to Macomb, Mississippi. Summit was just a stone's throw north of Macomb, and the living was just a little bit cheaper there. We made the move in the old 49 Ford that Big Steve had been driving since he and Miz Sally married a year after they graduated from Forest Hill High School in 1953. The old car was loaded down and sagging, with our suitcases tied on the top, along with my sister Renee's high chair. The 2 bird dogs, who smelled to high heaven, rode in the back seat beside me and beat me the whole way with their tails off and on. Oh, the overstuffed trunk was latched with a piece of rope, and Big Steve's younger brother, Jack, drove a borrowed pickup truck stuffed full of beds and household goods and pots and pans rattling around. Oh, what a mess we must have looked like as we rolled into Summit. Well, about 2 months after we had settled into our little home on Robb Street, the tired old Ford with peeling paint and seats, with exposed springs in the back sticking out everywhere, found yet another reason not to crank, and if it wouldn't crank, it sure wasn't going to take Big Steve to work. It wasn't long before that old rascal was propped up on blocks under a tarp and set beside our newly rented house. Well, we lived just 2 blocks from the center of town. Our little neighborhood was butted up against the I.C. railroad tracks and trestle on one side, and Highway 51 that cut through the town of Summit, running north and south, going either direction. If I close my eyes, I can still almost hear the lonesome moan coming off of those big old double and triple diesel engines as they hit the first crossing into town on the railroad. Man, the engineer blowing the whistle for all he was worth. The house shaking just slightly. The warning bell down there at the crossing clanging as a 100-car banana train hauling pulpwood flat cars and heavy freight would hit that downgrade and start picking up speed. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. You could feel the rumble in your feet if you stood barefoot on the concrete slab that Big Steve built onto the back of our house to hold his barbecue grill. The trains always rattled the windows in our kitchen and shook Miz Sally's china teacup collection that she began in earnest once we moved down to Summit. Big freight and passenger trains passed all through the day, headed north or south, and sometimes passing at the same time. Now that was some kind of sound. I especially remember those long trains that rumbled through our lives early, every morning, or late over in the evening about dinner time. Man, those were my favorites. I knew Big Steve would be home, and Miz Sally, whatever she had been doing in the day, would have something good cooked, and my sister Renee would be tame and tied into her high chair and not bothering me. Well, you know, the rumblings at our house didn't always come from the freight trains, though. One such rumble was over the lack of family transportation. With the old Ford headed to the junkyard, Big Steve must have looked in the bank book real hard before he stepped out onto that shaky limb to put his money down on a 4-cylinder Italian Fiat, complete with 2-tone paint, suicide doors, front-wheel drive, and a floppy, tan, fold-down bench seat in the back connected with the trunk. You have to keep in mind that in 1960, most automobiles were more than 17 feet long, and our little Fiat wasn't much longer than a VW Beetle. In 1960, small foreign cars raised eyebrows high. Folks stared. It didn't matter when or where. Tooling around town, going to church, or trying to squeeze on to the fast two-lane Highway 51. Folks passed us by with their eyes peeled and their heads a-shaking. I'm not sure whether folks stared more when we headed north to visit my mother's brother B.R., who raised her and lived on a chicken and truck farm up near Jackson, Mississippi, or when we fought the traffic headed south down to New Orleans, where Big Steve's mother, who worked as a registered nurse down there, lived in a small duplex apartment right in the heart of the city. I guess we got used to it, though, because we might have even taken a little pride in the long sideways glances, because we were the only little car like that anywhere around. 1 or 2 weeks a month on the weekend, we'd all pile into the Fiat and head one way or the other. On Highway 51, we called it the Summit Road. It was north to Jackson or south to New Orleans. We made the shorter trips north to visit with relatives, mainly to show off my sister Renee and how big she was getting. She was quickly growing from an arm baby into a lap baby, and she was running around the house, picking up everything, and she even had a few more teeth than before and enough hair for me to pull. My. Well, we kept the visits up year-round. In summer, the heat had us blasting up and down that two-lane Highway 51, that Summit Road, with the windows down, and Miz Sally up front with a scarf tied tight around her head, usually holding my sister on the seat between her and Big Steve. I usually had my head out the window howling like a bird dog, or doing my best impression of what a car with a real engine might sound like. Big Steve would be at the wheel of our small car, shifting gears and battling the tractor-trailer trucks for the use of the road, because as they passed us by, sucking air, with a mighty whoosh that left that small car clattering and weaving, we didn't know which lane we were going to end up in sometimes. Winter found us driving, all sitting nearly the same formation, front to back, except for not having any windows rolled up. They were rolled up tight, and our coats were buttoned right to the top. Big Steve always wore a hat, and that Fiat small heater hummed. Ooh, it could hum something, but it never hummed a song. Windows squealed in and out of time with the sound of the radio that was in our head, because there was no radio in that little car. Heaven forbid that it rained. While we were doing battle on the highway, if it rained, that little Fiat's wiper blades, they moved in opposite directions. One going left, one going right, and the water going anywhere except off the windshield. Big Steve usually ended up driving with his head sticking halfway out the driver's side window. Rain flying in, headlights alternating bright and dark, depending on how hard the downpour was. Well, it must have been in the spring of 1961 that the postman lodged a crisp, white envelope bearing a New Orleans postmark into the small postbox mounted beside our front door. The envelope contained a one-page note written with a fountain pen in a beautiful cursive hand. The envelope and note paper smelled something like my grandmother's bedroom. It was a combination smell of bath powder, hairspray, dental adhesive, and toilet cleaner. Kids notice these things, I suppose. It wasn't altogether an unpleasant odor. No, not altogether unpleasant. Well, Miz Sally plopped Renee into her high chair as usual in that evening that the letter came, and read the letter aloud at the dinner table after Big Steve came home from work. The note was from Big Steve's mama, who lived down there, and we called her Mama Doris. And the note read, Morale, that was her name for Big Steve. I have a hog in my bathtub, and I need you to come get him out and take him home right now. The twins are out on the boat again, and JC won't be back until who knows when. He's made me mad, And you know Jack doesn't have a phone, and you know he wouldn't come anyway. You come down here this weekend and get this hog, I mean it. Call me, collect, to let me know what time you'll be here to pick him up. Mama Doris. Well, she always was a strong woman. Don't you know our party line was humming that night when Big Steve had to book that collect call down to Mama Doris? Listening to her explain that one of the community social clubs in her downtown New Orleans neighborhood wanted everybody to have fresh ham for Easter. So during Mardi Gras, they made the rounds house to house and gave everyone a pig in a blanket. Turned out to be a real pig. Big Steve said if they wanted everybody to have a fresh ham, why didn't they just give them one? Well, I didn't know why. Mama Doris took her piglet and she named it Esmeralda in honor of Big Steve. And she proceeded to raise it in her house after she got it. After it started eating her downstairs furniture and gaining weight, she hefted it over into a bathtub, which was a tall, high-sided affair on clawed feet. It wasn't long before she couldn't manhandle that hog in and out of the tub that she had because she said it weighed more than 100 pounds, and she couldn't dare lift anything up like that. Well, we showed up at her door on a late frosty morning in March, and Mama Doris's hog must have weighed in well over 100, about 171 is what they finally said. Ooh, it was a big, ugly, smelly black and white brute that would bite you hard on your hand if you didn't handle it just right. Well, it took Big Steve and two of Mama Doris's slightly drunk neighbors to get that hog out of her bathtub, through the narrow duplex, down a flight of steep stairs, and after a few failed attempts, lodged into the trunk of that little Fiat. That biting hog was squealing, and pitching a fit. My sister was crying with the volume and enthusiasm of an opera singer and would not be comforted no matter what. Miz Sally was shouting orders while Mama Doris was bossing and complaining and making up, talking about how her floor was getting scratched and that we were scratching the wall getting that hog out and for Big Steve and those fellas to be careful. They were just straining and holding it all in silence. My. I'm sure I was doing a good job of getting in everybody's way. That seems to be one of my specialties. We made hog-scented, hasty goodbyes to Mama Doris. Now that hog was finally out of her bathtub and wedged into the small trunk of the Fiat, she was anxious to start cleaning and fumigating her house. She hardly waved goodbye as Big Steve piloted us out of her driveway down narrow one-way streets, across Canal Street and into the heavy traffic north on the first leg of our long drive home. Our car was beginning to smell like hog. Everybody was complaining. My sister was still crying, but nobody said very much because of the look on Big Steve's face. Man, we just looked out the windows and pretended to be somewhere else. Well, by mid-afternoon, the sun hung pale in the western sky as Big Steve paid our toll to drive across Lake Pontchartrain Causeway Bridge. Miz Sally had Renee laid out on the front seat. She was finally quiet, and I was fooling around in the back, thinking of all the things that I might be doing other than sitting in a car with a hog. The little Fiat engine hummed and the tires clickety-clacked along at about 50 miles an hour, shaking every now and then as a crosswind gusted in off of Lake Pontchartrain. Oh, it was during such a wind gust that the big hog, not used to riding in the back of a car like ours, plunged headlong from his spot in the trunk, right through the back seat, breaking the latch over the top as he ran over me, springing headlong, diving for the open passenger window where Miss Sally was sitting. Woo-hoo-hoo! You have never heard such a mess. That giant hog missed his mark as his back feet slipped when he launched off. Struggling, that hog ripped the rear seat cover and ended up jamming his big head between the suicide doors and the front bench seat. It slid halfway down and was stuck, foaming and biting and kicking with his hind legs running in place. Big Steve groaned mightily as that hog squealed to high heaven, and Miz Sally led us all in a chorus of screams that would fit nicely into any drive-in B movie. Woo, I'll never forget that. Miz Sally grabbed my sister up off the front seat and just about jumped into Big Steve's lap as that hog got to biting down at her. And it sure wasn't easy to drive, considering that the steering wheel and the stick shift was stuck between a mad hog. What a motivator. I was jumping and dodging in the back as the head was stuck, but the back feet were free and flying. Big Steve was pinned against the door by Miss Sally and Renee, and it's a near miracle that we were able to weave our way off the causeway rather than driving right over the guardrail and into the Pontchartrain. Carefully navigating us off the bridge, weaving from side to side, Big Steve threaded through the heavy traffic and was aiming at a spot where he might pull over and take care of the situation. From the back seat, while trying to grab onto and hold on to those wild hog legs to keep them off of me, I really didn't know what happened until I fell on my side suddenly as we skidded to a stop in the ditch. Big Steve said later that the little car was so out of balance with that hog jumping on the side and the whole family jammed up on the other that it was hard to control. Miss Sally had stopped screaming, but Renee was crying along on her own and harmonizing with that hog. It was at about that time, before any of us could react, that I saw flashing red lights behind us, and boy, oh boy, was I scared. The shadow fell across my window where all I could see of that Louisiana State Trooper was a large khaki-clad torso wearing a gleaming black Sam Brown belt. Oh, I remember that like yesterday. Big Steve grimaced, mostly. I don't recall him saying much, if anything at all, as he just sat there, pinned against the Fiat front door by Miss Sally, who was quieter now than I ever remember her in any kind of disaster, and the sound of the passing traffic fought for our ears as my sister and that big hog would not give up or give in on their squealing and howling. That big Louisiana State Trooper tipped his hat, looked us over, and just shook his head as he approached the car. I'm guessing that he took one look at our out-of-state Mississippi license plate, considered the paperwork, took a second look at that big old hog and reconsidered the paperwork and must have thought to himself, well, no one would believe it anyway. It's Sunday and just about quitting time. He nodded at us again, turned and walked to his big old black and white patrol car, hit the siren and the gas, and left us right where we sat in the ditch. Big Steve came alive then and hollered for me, "Get out of the car! Get out of the car!" Miss Sally held my sister Renee while I got out and opened up the trunk. Big Steve pushed the side of the Fiat from the front while he's on the outside and rolled it just enough that we'd be able to climb up out of the ditch. Then he reached in through the open trunk and tied that hog's back legs with a little rope. As he grabbed that big hog from behind, I opened up the passenger door, freeing that big old hog's head, and he pulled it back into a spot between the trunk and the back seat. With a mighty heave, that very, very unhappy hog found itself all tied up again and back in the trunk. Bam! The lid slammed shut. Big Steve drove us smoothly out of the ditch and back up onto the fast-running highway where we waited our turn. I was told to ride with my feet stretched out against the front seat, which was a belt-punishable no-no, but was excused in this case, as we sure did not want that hog to be coming back out of that trunk. We made it home to Summit, exhausted, with that hog still raising a fuss, but still in the trunk. Big Steve unloaded the hog by himself into the empty dog pen in our backyard, where we kept him for a few days until a man came in a big old blue pickup truck with a trailer to haul him off. Miss Sally put Renee and me to bed, but long after dressing in my favorite pajamas decorated with cowboys, Indians, and horses, I lay there and sleep would not come. I just laid there on my bunk bed in the dark, my mind's eye filled with the image of a giant monster hog squealing and snapping at me, closer and closer. Oh, not long before sunrise, after a night of tossing and turning and trying to get away from my dream of that giant hog, the regular freight train rolled on past. It was a long one, with a big old diesel engine and maybe 100 cars passing through in the darkness, and they all carried my worries just a little further on down the line. After a while, it seemed like everything was going to be all right. Well, 3 weeks or so after Easter, with the weather turning warm, we loaded up and took that 171-pound hog back down to New Orleans to my grandmother, Mama Doris. Only this time, it was packed securely in an ice chest. Actually, 2 ice chests. Woo! It was a lot easier, too, and not nearly as memorable. We didn't run off the road or meet any highway patrolman. Woo, but it did smell much better, because I tell you what, a smoked hog is a lot better than a live one. We had a big dinner and ate on that hog for what seemed like 2 days. Spring became summer, and the trains kept rolling past our small home in Summit. By the fall, I never dreamed of that hog again. The New Orleans Social Club handed out pigs in a blanket for 3 more years after that, before some other social group in the city insisted that they stop it. My grandmother always got one, but she never ever tried to raise another hog in her bathtub. 171-pound hog in the house, in the car, and over in the ditch was enough for any family.